Ladies and gentlemen, once again is that time when we invite Giri Sivaraman, a principal of Maurice Blackburn, and he is the head of the firm of Queensland Employment Law Department based in Brisbane, which is listed by the highly respected Doyle's Guide to Australian Legal Professional as one of the top-tier law firms for employees in Queensland. And it is wonderful to, Giri, once again, to have you here into the series.
Thanks very much for having me back, Umesh. A real pleasure to be here.
And of course, moving on today, we will be talking about something which is very current. And it is current, it is prevalent, but of course we know that people and their rights and obligations, of course, has to be maintained. So today we are going to be talking about COVID vaccinations and its implications, if there are employers who make it mandatory. Gary?
That's right.
So, moving on, when we look at the conditions that have been put on, some of the employers are asking their employees, and making it compulsory. Is it possible to be made compulsory, or is it lawful? Is it legal?
Yeah, it's a good question, Umesh. If an employer issues a direction that you must get vaccinated, the direction has to be both lawful and reasonable. It's going to be lawful. The only time a direction is not lawful is if it requires you to do something unlawful, and clearly there's nothing unlawful about being vaccinated. So then it becomes a question of, well, is it reasonable? And there's a lot of different considerations that go into this. Now, if, for example, you work in an area where the government has mandated vaccinations, then it's going to be reasonable. There won't be any way around that. If you work in an area where there's a risk of exposure, what they call Tier 1 employees, where you're dealing with, for example, arrivals from overseas or interstate, it will be seen as reasonable. If you're dealing with vulnerable people who have a greater risk if they get COVID, it will be seen as reasonable. If you work in close proximity to other employees, it will be seen as reasonable. So I think in a lot of different circumstances it's going to be seen as reasonable, and once it's a lawful and reasonable direction, if you disobey it, then the employer will be able to take disciplinary action against you.
Okay, but looking at the human rights and the personal rights of people as well, so can employees say, no, I'm not going to get the vaccination?
Yeah, I understand some people have concerns, although the majority of Queenslanders are above the age of 12, and the majority of Australians, it seems, above the age of 12 have been vaccinated, or at least got their first dose. There's going to be limited ability to refuse a direction. If you've got a strong medical reason where you say, I will have an anaphylactic reaction or some other serious adverse reaction to the vaccination, that is something that the employer will have to try and accommodate by perhaps offering you reasonable alternative duties. But beyond a strong medical exemption, I don't think there will be any other legal ground where you can say, I have a particular right, human right, that stops you from requiring me to be vaccinated. So if you say my religion says that I'm not to be vaccinated, or my conscience says I'm not to be vaccinated, or my political belief says I'm not to be vaccinated, I don't think any of those will stand up in a court of law. I think what a court or a tribunal will say is, unless it's a strong medical reason, those other objections won't be enough to stop the direction from being carried out by the employer.
Okay, when we look at so many people who took to the streets, and there had been some protests and everything, so were they ill-founded or were they based on some grounds?
It's really sad, I think, to see some of the scenes coming in terms of the protesting, and I heard today that some police officers in Victoria who were trying to control the crowds were infected with coronavirus, and one's actually in ICU, and I think that's really, really sad that someone who's trying to do their job is exposed to that risk. I think it's unacceptable, to be honest, but the issue is that being said, you do have some rights. So, for example, your employer's got an obligation to consult with you, and so you should be consulted with about any change or any significant issue relating to health and safety. And introducing mandatory vaccinations is a significant issue when it relates to health and safety. So your employer shouldn't just impose it. They should consult with the employees. They should talk about what's coming. If there's a union there, so they should definitely be consulting with the union about the direction. And if you're going to try and, I think, challenge the direction, the place to do it is through that consultation process, where you might talk about the reasons why you as an employee or as a group of employees don't think it's necessary, or alternatively just what measures you want in place before the direction is carried out. The other thing to remember, Umesh, is people talk about their rights in the sense of I don't want to be vaccinated, as in that's my right. Not me personally, I'm actually fully vaccinated, yeah. But what about the rights of others not to be exposed to the risk of those that are unvaccinated? And interestingly, there was a decision just a couple of days ago in New South Wales decision where a family received compensation, a very large amount of compensation, because the father of the family contracted COVID as a result of work, and he died from it. And so the tribunal held that work was a substantial contributing factor to the man getting COVID, and therefore, as a result of that, his death is a workers' compensation compensable death, and so the family received compensation. So, from an employer's perspective, they'll say, well, if we don't mandate COVID, or if we don't at least strongly recommend it, we're at risk, because then people who contract COVID at work due to someone else who wasn't vaccinated will say to us, why didn't you mandate COVID? Mandate the COVID vaccination. So it does, there are implications for employers if they don't either strongly recommend or mandate vaccinations against COVID for workers.
I think that's a very good point that you've just made there, Giri, but I'll just quickly go one step back. You talked about the employers and their obligation to communicate with the employees. And we have often found that in an industrial relation, that is very, very important. And many times that, or the lack of that, is where a lot of problems happen, because employers just put in some rules and they say this is it, and the lack of the consultation, and of course bigger group of employees where there are good strong union representation, as you mentioned, that unions should be involved in that decision making as well. So just take us through that, in a proper world, in a good business practice, what would the process be, for implementing mandatory vaccination?
Yeah, that's a good question, Umesh. So, I think if you're going to do it properly, you would first perhaps survey the employees and say, we're thinking about bringing in a vaccination. What are your views? What are your concerns? Then you might talk to employees about those concerns and address the concerns. You'd provide information to the employees about why it might be necessary, what are the concerns the employer has, and why what are the risks and why they can't be managed in other ways. And you'd give it a period of time. You would speak to the union if the employees are represented by a union. You'd follow any consultation requirements within a contract or an enterprise agreement. And then only after all of that is done would you, if you think it's necessary, you wouldn't if you don't think it's necessary, but if you think it's necessary, would you mandate the vaccination. Hopefully by going through all of those steps, you may not even need to mandate it, because having talked to people, you may have brought people along with you, and that's really the ideal outcome, where you're not forcing people to do it. They've decided, I think this is a good thing to do. My employers explained to me. Some other things that a good practice that an employer can do: offer paid time off to get the vaccination. If you say to people, you need to get vaccinated, but you've got to do it in your own time, they're going to be less inclined to do it, because they'll either have to take annual leave to do it, or else try and do it out of hours or on the weekend, which people are less inclined to do. But on the other hand, if you do like Maurice Blackburn has actually done, that is, Maurice Blackburn has said, if you want to get vaccinated, you just go and get vaccinated. You don't need to apply for leave. People are going to be much more inclined to do it. If you make it clear that if someone feels sick after the vaccination, they can take sick leave. That's another source of comfort to employees that will mean that they're more likely to get the vaccination. So all of those things are good proper steps an employer can take, which will mean they're more successful if they want to get their workforce vaccinated.
And I think that's a very, very good point, is that incentive and appreciation. That is something many times management fail to look at. And of course, if there are incentives in place, and if you appreciate your workers, you'll get so much more out of that. And isn't that a wonderful thing to say that, okay, you can go and get the vaccination done, and you won't be penalized for time. And if you do fall sick as a consequence, that you'll be entitled to your sick leave. And that's the way it should be. So, looking at the scenarios and of the says, are we aware of any cases of conflict between employers and employees?
Yeah, so there haven't been any cases on COVID vaccinations, but you might remember, Umesh, last year there were some directions issued by the Chief Health Officer about influenza vaccinations, mandating influenza vaccinations, and then more generally some aged care centres and other and childcare centres mandated influenza vaccinations. And there were some cases where people refused influenza vaccinations and were ultimately dismissed for doing that. So in those cases, there were cases involving a number of different workplaces. One involved an aged care centre, one involved a childcare centre, and in both those cases there wasn't strong medical evidence about it. One of them, a woman, she was actually from the Philippines. She'd come to Australia as a migrant. She said that she'd had an adverse reaction to an influenza vaccination when she was 7 years old in the Philippines, but had no medical evidence to back it up. She refused to go and see an immunologist or anyone like that in Australia, and so she was dismissed. And the Commission, the Fair Work Commission, ultimately said that the dismissal was fair, that it was a lawful and reasonable direction for her to get vaccinated. And many of our listeners who've come from India might have the same problem in the sense of things that have happened to them in India. They're not able to produce the medical records here in Australia. The other case involved childcare, where that wasn't about. There wasn't strong medical evidence. It was a person who had sort of holistic health treatment, and she said it wasn't good for her body to get vaccinated. But the Commission said, no, look, childcare, you're dealing with children. It's very tactile, constantly hands-on. It's a lawful and reasonable direction. So, but there've been other sources of conflict, interestingly enough, Umesh. So there's a case where a man was asked to provide his travel history to his employer, and he refused to do so, and he was dismissed, and ultimately the dismissal was held to be fair. And I think that may be relevant going forward, Umesh. Of course, again, I know you travel a bit, and I'm sure plenty of the listeners to this show travel either to India or to other places. And so disclosing, and they may not want to disclose their travel history, but that was deemed to be fair. There was a case where two women were told to work in two separate areas and not interact with each other, and they did, and they were dismissed for doing that. And that was a COVID-related direction because they didn't want the risk of infection being transmitted. And that dismissal was held to be fair. So if you look at the cases, they've tended to side with employers. And that's, I think, because the Commission, the Fair Work Commission in all of these cases has taken a pretty conservative approach and decided, look, this is a once-in-a-100-year pandemic. It's a very serious issue. The effect on businesses as well, if there is a case, is so dramatic. You've got to shut down the business. You've got to send everyone home for 14 days. You can't have a workforce for 14 days. You've got to pay for a deep clean. And I read somewhere in the newspaper that a deep clean can cost $4,000. I mean, if you're a small business, that's incredibly expensive. So it's a balancing out. The employee will have certain interests, of course, including how they want to take care of their own body. But the employer's got some pretty significant interests as well. There is one issue in all of this that hasn't been fully explored, and that is if you ask me whether I've been vaccinated, you're actually asking me to disclose to you what's described as sensitive information in the Privacy Act. And there are limitations on employers obtaining sensitive information from employees. It's got to be with my consent and reasonably necessary, and I can't be coerced into doing it. Now, there are emergency circumstances where you don't need to get that consent, and I think a lot of employers will say, well, with a pandemic, those are emergency circumstances, and that may well be the case for now. But just down the track, I think when the pandemic eventually subsides, there will be this sleeper issue as to how the privacy laws interact with employers requiring evidence of vaccinations, and we'll have to see how that unfolds.
And this is where the policy makers and the policy comes in, because as you have just mentioned, that going down the track when the pandemic is over, by that time there might be some legislation. There might even be application forms where it might become a standard thing and to say, are you vaccinated or not? But as the law stands now, is what everything will be gauged on. In moving forward, looking at all these the conditions and the COVID vaccinations being made mandatory, when we look at, say, the privacy of information, which we just talked about, is it unreasonable for an employer to ask an employee when, with two friends or someone meets in a casual talk, people say, hey, I've got both my vaccinations, are you vaccinated? So where does that stand?
Yeah, that's a good question, Umesh. And this was an issue that was actually the subject of a case, not the vaccination issue, but the issue of privacy. So it's a case where a fellow was working at a sawmill, and the sawmill used to have that, the old Bundy system, but they changed to a biometric scan, a thumbprint scan, and he refused to do it. He said, I don't want to give you that sensitive information, and he was dismissed. He challenged it, and he actually won. The Fair Work Commission said, well, actually, biometric information is sensitive, as described in the Privacy Act, and you can't coerce someone into giving it to you. And it's not reasonable because you had another way of collecting this information for a long period of time. The difference, of course, with the vaccinations is, well, there is no other way. You've got to find out, I think, directly from the employee or not. So in those circumstances, the employee might say, well, I don't want to tell you, and the employer might say, well, how do we manage this risk? And it is a significant risk. So privacy rights should not be overlooked, and they are very important, and employers shouldn't think that just because they can ask about vaccinations they can ask about everything else. I've seen cases where the most extreme was I ran a case for a union against an employer who suddenly said, if you want this job, you have to give us a blood sample, and we're going to analyse that blood sample. And we challenged that, saying, we filed an application in the federal court saying that's not lawful. Why do you need a blood sample? Why do you need to know all of these things for this job? And ultimately the company caved in and they withdrew that direction. So there certainly need to be, and it's very important that there are limitations on how far an employer can inquire into your private life. But in terms of vaccinations, it may not be the case that the employer can be stopped from asking you as to whether you've been vaccinated or not.
And I think that that is a very, very fair comment there, because at this point in time, moving forward, it might become a normal thing, for people. But of course, asking about private things and asking for a blood test, I think that's going a little bit over the top. So Giri, just in conclusion, could you like to, give a summary of this situation of where people or employers asking for employees to be vaccinated before they can be provided employment?
Yeah. So, in summary, employers will, if they issue a direction that you be vaccinated against COVID, it has to be lawful and reasonable. It will always be lawful, I think. It's just a question of whether it's reasonable. I think in a lot of circumstances it will be seen as reasonable because it will be seen as an effective way to manage risk and also prevent the disastrous effects that can happen to employers if there is a COVID outbreak. It won't always be the case. There can be circumstances where we won't be reasonable, but they will be. It will depend on a case-by-case basis, and there will be medical exemptions if you can't do it, and if it's going to cause you an adverse reaction that's too risky, the employer should look at alternate duties. I don't think, though, there will be exemptions for political or conscience or religious objections. Whether it's lawful or not, though, the employer should definitely, and whether it's lawful or reasonable or not, the employer should definitely be consulting with employees and their unions before instituting the direction, because that's both required by law and also best practice in terms of trying to get people to do it.
And best practice is what people should always have in their practices, in their businesses, in their workplaces. So Giri, just in conclusion, if someone needs a little bit more information, of course, in a session we can discuss so much, which is sort of touching the tip of the iceberg, as they say. There could be many things, and many things could be individually different as well. The nature of the conversation and the advice here is quite generic and general, and not relating to any individual. So if any individual has some queries or information, what should they do and how can they contact you?
Yeah. So if you want some further advice on this, you're more than welcome to have a consultation with me, and I've obviously given a fair bit of advice on this already. Just look me up on the Maurice Blackburn website and get in touch. All of my details are there, and someone from my team will talk to you, and then I'm more than happy to have an appointment with you in person, phone, Teams, whatever works, and we can talk through your particular situation.
And those details are there on the screen, so the numbers and the office number and the email address. So please do contact them if you have any further questions. Once again, Giri, thank you so much for this very, very timely and very important topic and the discussion on that. So, ladies and gentlemen, there you go, the first installment of the Community Matters with Giri Sivaraman of Maurice Blackburn Solicitors. If you have any particular topic that you'd like discussed, we would welcome that. So please do be in touch with us, give us your comments, and if there are any topics that you feel that we should cover on the segment, we will do that. So once again, it is wonderful to have your company, and thanks Giri Sivaraman for being here in the studios and discussing on this very, very timely topic. Until the next time, it goes bye from us.